Welcome, fellow beekeepers. This is Jamie Walters, OSBA's Maumee Valley Director and News Editor. I'm pleased to announce OSBA's new live webinar training series. Live sessions are recorded on the second and fourth Sunday of each month, 7 p.m. through Zoom conference call. You're welcome to attend by making a reservation on OSBA's website at www.ohiostatebeekeepers.org. Go to the events page and scroll down to the event you would like to attend. Confirm your RSVP by filling out the registration form with your city, state, name, and email address. Approximately 2 hours before the beginning of Sunday's webinar, an active Zoom link will be sent to your email address. Each training session will be recorded and posted on the following Sunday on OSBA's new YouTube channel. You can find it at Ohio State Beekeepers Association. You're welcome to subscribe and be sure to click the bell to be alerted each time we upload a new video. Each month's speakers and presentation will be posted on the Facebook page, by direct email to registered and paid members, and our website at ohiostatebeekeepers.org. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at editor@ohiostatebeekeepers.org. And now on to our previous recorded webinar.
Welcome to our speaker for today, Denise Ellsworth. She is the Pollinator Education Program Director, and she was in Summit County Extension prior to being in the Pollinator Education Program for 18 years, and she was very intimately involved in managing their Master Gardener program. Denise loves gardening, as most of us do in Extension, hiking along the Tuscaroras River, yoga, and of course cooking. And she was just sharing with me that she's been doing plenty of cooking in these last few weeks. So with that, everybody give Denise a warm welcome.
Great, thanks Pam. Let me share my program here. So happy to be with you. Thanks everybody for joining us. We're going to talk about some different ideas for incorporating plants and gardening elements into your landscape to favor pollinators. Just a second. There we go. So I call this theme gardens for pollinators because I love the idea of how creative gardeners are. And you know this if you've been on garden tours or you've gone to friends' houses, looked at their gardens. Everybody has kind of a different approach to their garden and their personality comes out that way. So whether you're really into herbs or you're really into cut flowers, medicinal plants, native plants, what have you, your personality is really reflected in how you build a garden and build a landscape. And so we're going to talk about some of the different themes you could use to attract pollinators, some of the plants that are going to be magnets for pollinators, and also some of those garden elements. So no matter how you garden or how you grow, you'll get a lot of pollinators coming to visit. So just a quick word about the pollinators and who they are. Most of the pollinators that we see in Ohio are insects. We do have hummingbirds as our bird example. And we'll talk a little bit about what hummingbirds need. We don't have bats that are pollinating plants in Ohio. So we really look to our insects, to our beetles and our flies, our moths and butterflies, and primarily bees. So we'll kind of focus on what bees need in the landscape and how we can attract all these different pollinators in. So if you put a pollinator garden or butterfly garden into your web browser, you come up with lots of cookie cutter ideas, and there's nothing wrong with following a guide or a plan to create a pollinator garden. But I want to look at some different approaches that we can take in your own garden to attract pollinators. So some simple steps that I always promote when I'm teaching folks about pollinators is that we need to grow more flowers for pollinators. And that's not really the same thing as growing more flowers because some flowers don't have much for pollinators at all. So we need to select flowers that really have good rewards, good qualities that pollinators like. We need to protect habitat for nesting and resting. And this is kind of a forgotten element that a lot of gardeners don't think of. So we'll talk about why that's so important. Reducing or eliminating pesticide use is really key when we're trying to invite these insects into our garden. We need to watch our practices. And then spreading the word, which is what master gardeners and others are great at doing. Having a beautiful garden, teaching other people what you're doing. So we can incorporate plants into existing landscapes. So that may be a couple purple coneflowers, for example. I think most of us grow purple coneflower if you have 5 or 6 hours of sunlight. This is a plant that can go in a pot on your deck. It can go in your community garden plot, or it can go in your sunny perennial borders. So how do we incorporate some of these great pollinator plants into the existing landscape? Or maybe you want a dedicated garden space for pollinators. This is a pollinator garden at Penn State in Happy Valley, a real nice dedicated area, and we can see some of our perennial favorites here with some Monarda, world milkweed, some Joe Pye weed, ironweed, so some of those great native plants that are excellent for pollinators. So you could have a, a specific pollinator plot or garden. Or maybe you have a little more space to play with and you want to create a meadow or a prairie like this one down at the Dawes Arboretum in Newark. We're not going to focus on how to create a meadow. There's some really great resources out there. At the end, I'll point you to our Bee Lab website. We have actually one of the conservation managers from Dawes who recorded a webinar for us a couple years ago, a really nice webinar on how to create a meadow, and lots of other resources as well. But even if you don't have a large space for a meadow, maybe you have a small space. This is a little prairie area that we have at Seacrest Arboretum in Worcester. So not a very big space, but a lot of plant diversity. We have flowering plants, forbs, and grasses as well. And so we get lots of different pollinators as well as birds coming into this plot. So you don't have to have a, even a half acre. You can have a smaller space and build in those elements of having a meadow or a prairie. So what do pollinators need from habitat? This is a plot out at, or landscape site out at the Wilds in Cumberland, Ohio. Maybe some of you have been there. That Dr. Karen Goodell manages. She's a researcher at OSU Newark, and she manages some research plots out there at the Wilds. And in the back of this image, you can see these crop circles back here. These are where Dr. Goodell has planted some different mixes of pollinator plants, mostly native perennials, some non-natives and some non-perennials in there. So she has different mixes that she's planted, and then she studies who visits all of those different areas and where are those bees living. Are they in those little remnant patches of forest? And so her work has really highlighted how important not just the food plants are for pollinators. Yes, they need the pollen and the nectar. They need a certain arrangement of that habitat, but they also need a place to live, right? They need to be able to nest, whether they're nesting in rotting wood or nesting in stems or nesting in bare soil. So all those elements need to come together to really create that good habitat. So let's turn our attention to the flowers. What is it about flowers that draws pollinators there? The flower is really the flag, right? This is the advertisement that says, come pollinators, come visit me. I have some rewards for you. And the beautiful colors that we see on a flower like this are really to draw those pollinators in. The yellow marks on the petals here are, that's not where the pollen actually is, but that's an enticement to help the pollinator make a quick target into that flower and to get the reward. So the flower's goal is really to attract, reward, and repeat those visitors. So bring them in, give them a little bit of reward for coming, and then send them off because they want repeat visitors. They want that insect to come back with a little bit of pollen from a similar plant that's a little genetically different to pollinate that flower. And so what are those rewards? Well, we primarily think of pollen and nectar as the rewards that flowers offer for, in this case, two bees visiting flowers. On the left, this little mining bee, you can see how full her legs are with pollen. So she's there to get that protein source that the flower's offering. The queen bumblebee on the right, she's visiting my tree peony, and she actually didn't care much about the pollen. She wasn't collecting or gathering pollen that day. She wanted the nectar from that flower. So that's the flight fuel. That's how insects, that's the fuel that they use to fly around the landscape. So that carbohydrate source. So those are the primary rewards that pollinators get from flowers. But they can also get a place to meet other like-minded pollinators, right? A place to gather, maybe get a little shelter. These little hoverflies or flower flies gathering here in one of my native roses, they're actually eating a little bit of pollen. Roses don't offer a nectar reward, but it's also a great place to gather and find a mate. So we know that certain kinds of pollinators need specific kinds of rewards. And so if we're trying to attract hummingbirds, for example, we know that those flowers are typically red and have a long tube. That's what hummingbirds are attracted to. And the flower offers a nectar reward, right? The hummingbirds don't need pollen. They're not there to gather pollen. And so those flowers tend to have lots of nectar, but not a lot of pollen to gather. So we know that if we're trying to get butterflies to our garden, we need nectar for the adult butterflies with those long tongues that dip down into those flowers to drink that flight fuel. But we also know that we need the host plant, the caterpillar food, if we want that whole life cycle. So including the host source, in this case, the milkweed that those caterpillars need. Then those caterpillars transforming into adults, and we have the nectar to fuel the flight of those adults. So to bring in all those pollinators and to give them what they need, we can include different flower shapes, colors, and sizes and bloom times in our landscape. This shot is from the butterfly garden at Holden Arboretum up in Kirtland, Ohio in Lake County, which is a really beautiful landscape if you've never been up there to see their butterfly garden. And they do exactly that. They have lots of different flower types. We see here flowers in the daisy family, in the onion family, in the mint family, lots of different shapes and sizes, blooming kind of at all different times in succession through the season. So as much as you can, including this idea into your own garden, having that diversity of flower shape, color, and size. And trying to span the season with bloom is really essential. We're just coming out of our really strong early spring bloom period for our trees, and those are so key for pollinators. If you think about your maples and your willows, your redbuds, all of those plants, they're blooming with thousands and thousands of flowers when there aren't a lot of other flowers around. And that's what the bees are keying in on early in the season. We have a progression of pollinators that visit throughout the spring and summer and into the fall. And so we really need to think, how do we span that season from our earliest maple blooms all the way through to those aster flowers? And so many of our bees are visiting at different times of the year. So on the left here, we have a mason bee. On the top, they're a very early season orchard pollinator, and so they need those early season flowers. Likewise, the polyester bee that's on the bottom left, very early season. I think of these when redbuds, for kind of the time from star magnolia in bloom to redbuds in bloom. Queen bumblebee right there in the middle, very early season bee out there looking for a place to nest. And then we see her daughters, the new queens, out late summer and early fall. So different needs at different times of the season. On the right is a longhorn bee, and she's actually a specialist. We'll talk about what that means. She's a pollen specialist on ironweed. And so she's going to emerge as an adult around the time that ironweed is in bloom. So we have different pollinators at different times. We need to think of having flowers for those pollinators that give them the rewards they need through the season. Here's some queen bumblebees. There's actually 4 queen bumblebees visiting these crocus in bloom. This is a great reason to plant more crocus in your garden. And you can imagine from that queen bumblebee's perspective, this is huge purple flower right there on the ground. There's not a lot else in bloom, right, when your crocuses are in flower. And so this is a real target for those queen bumbles. They need the nectar, they need to start gathering pollen so they can rear their first generation of daughters, the workers that will help them to create that colony. So very early season flowers for our queen bumbles. Some plant lists, like this one from Cornell that talks about orchard plantings, how you can enhance orchard pollination through fence rows and other plantings on the farm, really walk through this progression. So having some early season bloom or serviceberries and redbuds all the way through to our asters and our goldenrods. And here's our longhorn bee at the end of the season. The female's there on the left. We can see all the pollen packed in her, we call them chaps, or back in her hind legs. So all that orange yellow pollen that she's gathered from asters. And then the males there on the right in this lek or group gathering of males. And you can see why they're called longhorn bees. They have these really long antennae as males. And the males just kind of hang out there waiting for females to come so that they can mate. So here's another tool that is a way that you can strategize having plants that bloom all the way through the season. And I know many of you are probably very familiar with a Ohio State phenology calendar and how this works, but I just wanted to spend a minute on it. The calendar wasn't developed to recommend pollinator plants, but many of the plants that are listed on the calendar are excellent for pollinators and really focus on that succession of bloom through the season. So if you are looking for the calendar, you can put GDD and space OSU into your web browser. You put in your zip code and you can default to today's date, or you can put a past date in. And then the calendar drops you into this screen, which shows you what's in bloom around you. So here a couple days ago for me in Canton, we had 138 heat units, and on the left you could see that saucer magnolias and common flowering quince were in bloom, and Bradford calorie pears were just coming into first bloom along with weeping cherry. So then if I click on view full calendar, I get dropped into this whole long list of plant material from the earliest in bloom. We talk about silver and red maples all the way through the season with Rose of Sharon, if you can think how late that is in your garden season. So we can scroll through this list to get a feel for what's in bloom now, what's coming into bloom next, and use that to select some different plants that can fill some gaps in the landscape. Now, these are only trees and shrubs that are on this list. They're native and non-native plants. And again, it wasn't developed to be a list of pollinator plants, but can be a really nice way to get a sense for what's blooming when and how we can use that sequence to kind of enrich our garden palette. Okay, back to some elements that we're using then in the landscape. This is the butterfly garden again at Holden Arboretum. And this shows an excellent example of how we can plant in drifts or masses. Right in the middle of this image is mountain mint, which is one of my very favorite plant for pollinators. You're going to get lots of different bees and butterflies and flies, other pollinators visiting mountain mint. And by having that mass of mountain mint or joe pye or phlox, it's an easy invitation for the pollinators. They can smell those flowers, they can see that flower color. It's easy for them to find the reward. Bees also tend to be faithful or constant when they're visiting flowers, so they like to visit flowers of the same type in one trip. That kind of saves them some energy as well. So if you can plant in some larger masses, that's going to help pollinators save a little bit of time and energy as they work to gather that food to take back to the nest for the young. How about hybrids and cultivars? Well, actually at the Butterfly Garden at Holden, they did some data collection with some different hybrids and cultivars of joe pye, or not joe pye, but purple coneflower, and evaluated those cultivars to see, are the pollinators still visiting them? Are the butterflies still interested? Do the bees like these flowers? And so it's not that you shouldn't plant this hot papaya purple coneflower if that's something that you really like and want to have in your garden. But the question is, are the pollinators really using that flower? Are they getting the reward? Are they able to work this flower and access that nectar and that pollen? And if they're not, maybe you want to also include what we see there in the background, the straight species of purple coneflower. And what they found at Holden, and they're looking at different hybrids and cultivars, was they didn't see as many bees and butterflies on those kind of fancy pants purple coneflowers. So, you know, sometimes we have orange or green, some different flower colors or different flower arrangements, and it could be that the pollinator isn't as attracted to those strange colors, or isn't, you know, there's not as much scent in that flower, or not the reward that they are hoping for. But again, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't plant some of those hybrids and cultivars if that's something that interests you from a garden perspective. And sometimes the pollinators don't read the book, so they don't know they shouldn't be interested. So how about single flowers versus double flowers? And we'll use the rose garden here at Kingwood in Mansfield for an example. So on the left, we have two examples of very open roses with only 5 petals. And it's really easy to see all those anthers massed there in the middle of that flower. So easy also if you're a bee and you're there to gather pollen, easy to find that reward, get right in there and take that resource back and then make a return visit. Now, if the rose has a double flower, lots of petals, think of your David Austin roses. Definitely not as inviting. The pollinator may not even be able to find the pollen reward. They can't see it for all the flowers. And so not the best choice for pollinators. Again, it doesn't mean you shouldn't plant David Austin roses. If you love them and they have a place in your landscape, maybe also plant some of those native roses that may be more simple in structure, but that allow the pollinators to get in there and find the reward. So let's look at our herb garden. There are lots and lots of options in the herb garden, lots of plants that are really inviting to pollinators. Some of you in the southern part of the state, maybe your chives are blooming or about to bloom. So many plants in the onion family, lots of reward, lots of enticement, easy to see the pollinators on there, so it's fun to watch the bees visiting our chives. Many of the herbs in the mint family, so think of your thyme and lavender, oregano and basil, they tend to be rich in nectar. And again, if we can allow those plants to go to flower, which isn't always an option in the herb garden. If we're growing basil to cook with, we don't really want it to go to flower. But if we're done with those leaves, we let that plant go ahead to flower. We're going to find lots of pollinators there in the garden. Borage on the top right, really nice honeybees. So a wealth of opportunities in the herb garden, and you don't need a lot of space to be able to do this. The other benefit of having those herbs in bloom is that you tend to also invite the beneficial insects. So these are the predators and parasitoids that are going to help to keep some of your pest problems down to a dull roar in the garden. Those insects often need the nectar, they need a little bit of pollen as they're looking for prey in the garden. So you get kind of double duty there. You're inviting the pollinators and also the beneficial insects. So let's keep talking about native plants, which are really key for pollinators. Some of the trees that I mentioned earlier, those early season trees as being so important in our phenology calendar, they're really key for our native pollinators as well. So why are native plants so good for native pollinators? Well, they evolve together. And so those plants tend to target their rewards to the pollinators that they know are going to visit the flowers and be good return visitors. And so if we can include those native plants, it tend to have the reward that the pollinators need. So here's our longhorn bee that I mentioned. That's an ironweed pollen specialist. So let's talk about what it means to be a pollen specialist. So this is the female ironweed longhorn bee that we see here, and we can see on her hind legs how white they are. She has all that pollen from ironweed packed into kind of loosely into long hairs on her hind legs. So the female is only going to visit ironweed for pollen. She may go to different plants to get that flight fuel, the nectar, but she's a specialist on the pollen because that's the only food that her offspring will need to grow and mature into adults. So you don't even need many ironweed plants to have enough food for this bee. One ironweed plant can provide enough food. I think 7 flowers is what we say is enough for one little baby bee. So don't need to have a whole pasture, but just a few plants of these native perennials can be enough to favor those specialist bees. About 20% of all of our bees are specialists. So we think of, from a butterfly's perspective, we think of monarchs, And we know that monarch caterpillars have to have milkweed, and this is kind of an equivalent there. These are bees that have to have a certain pollen for the young to develop into adults. So another example with asters in this case, so this is a mining bee that has to have aster pollen for the young to develop. So asters are going to invite lots of different pollinators. You're going to see butterflies and all kinds of flies and bees visiting aster. But there are 7 species of bees that have to visit aster. It's the only food they can collect for their young. So by providing these native plants, we've really provided them, provided food for those specialists they may not be able to find elsewhere in the neighborhood. This is a little polyester bee. They're called polyester bees because they make these little polyester sacs on their cells in the ground that kind of waterproof the little bubbles, and that's where the offspring develop. So inside that little cellophane bubble is food and an egg that hatches into a larva that eventually pupates and emerges as an adult polyester bee. And that adult polyester bee, that female, is going to go back only to goldenrod to gather pollen to provision cells for her offspring. So with goldenrod, we're going to have all kinds of pollinators visit this plant, but of those bees, 11 of them are specialists. They can only visit goldenrod. And again, it doesn't take a lot of plants, maybe just a few in the landscape, and will provide really important food for some of those native bees. Here's a tree example. So willow is really key in the landscape, and we have 11 species of bees that specialize on willow pollen. So they have to collect willow pollen for their young. Okay, so let's turn our attention back to those trees that, as I mentioned, are so important in early spring. I just had someone, maybe Nancy's on the call today, I just had someone email me and she said, which spring ephemerals, so wildflowers, like think trillium, bear's breeches, are really key for those early season bees? And my response was, you know what, it's the trees that are so important. So those maples, willows, those serviceberries, they're blooming in the spring, kind of getting our pollinators going up until the red buds kind of in the real beginning, the heat of spring. So trees are really essential. A catalpa is a wonderful native tree that does something really interesting. So we can see on this catalpa flower, there are yellow-orange spots on that flower. That looks like pollen, but it's just an invitation. It tells the pollinator where to go. And then we have those purple nectar guides that kind of guide the bee in to find the nectar and the pollen. So bees will visit catalpa during the day, and bees can take a higher concentration of sugar in through their tongues, but it's the moths that visit catalpa at night. And so the flower adapts to that night visiting moth by reducing the sugar concentration in the nectar. So just another way that these native plants can really customize their rewards to the visitors, even at different times during the day. So definitely the native trees are offering the food, the pollen and nectar for pollinators, but they're also providing some places to nest. So there are a number of bees that will nest in broken twigs, in logs that have fallen to the ground or that are rotting in place. So these can provide homes for pollinators like mason bees and leaf-cutting bees. Shrubs are really important as well. So here we are back at Kingwood. And I love how they've developed these layers here at Kingwood. So they plant some annuals and some perennials. They've put in the hydrangeas, the shrub layers, and then they have the trees behind them. So they have the lots of different elements for the habitat of all kinds of different animals. So as we get into spring and early summer, our shrubs really going to take over as far as offering rewards for pollinators. So hydrangeas are a thought, spireas, our iteas and our clethra into the summer, our bottlebrush buckeye there on the left, really nice for butterflies through the heat of summer. So again, thinking about creating those layers in the garden, we have the perennials, maybe you have a little bit of a water feature, but having those shrubs and those trees, so we have lots of different habitat elements to provide the homes and the food that pollinators need. Okay, let's look at our herbaceous plants for pollinators. So some of these we talked about already, our goldenrod, our asters, our purple coneflowers, mountain mints. And so we compiled a list of some of our favorite native perennials for pollinators by looking at research that Karen Goodell did down at the Wilds and that Mary Gardner has done up in Cleveland, and that our phenology garden collaborators across the state have collected data over the years and really found some of these key plants that are so important for pollinators. So things like milkweed and bee balm. Here's our full list. Some of our favorites in the garden: the hyssop, the Joe Pye weeds, our penstemon, our beard tongue. So really a nice palette of plants. Some of them taller, some of them different flower colors to choose from. But all being so inviting to our pollinators. So here's our ironweed down at the left, good for that specialist bee that we talked about, that Melissodes longhorn bee. All right, well, let's go to the vegetable garden. If you are a big vegetable gardener, hopefully you're incorporating flowers right into the vegetable garden, and that'll help bring the pollinators in to pollinate the plants that you're hoping to harvest. So incorporating those cut flowers, maybe incorporating your herbs into the vegetable garden. It could also mean allowing your vegetable plants to go to flower when they're done. So for example, if you've got some arugula right now that you're going to be done harvesting, you've got some mustard greens or some kale, then allow those plants to go into flower. They can be very inviting for pollinators and also other beneficial insects. They're going to provide that pollen and nectar, and again, kind of concentrating that right there in the vegetable garden where maybe some of your pests were trying to get the upper hand. So how about a shade garden? This can be a little trickier to invite pollinators into. Most of the plants that we talked about so far, they prefer full sun. They prefer all day sunny location. But there are options if you have a very shady spot, maybe something like a Fothergilla shrub. Early season, before a lot of leaves have come out in the canopy, you're going to have pollinators visiting those bottlebrush flowers. Maybe something like geranium or hostas. Hostas are nice if you allow them to go to flower in the summer. You're going to get some of our larger bees, bumblebees and carpenter bees visiting those flowers. And then what I like to do with my hostas is when they're done flowering, I cut the stalk off at about knee height, so maybe 18 to 24 inches, cut that off and leave that stalk there in the landscape. It's just going to dry out. You're going to forget that that's there, but little bees are going to find it, maybe some little stem nesting bees. They don't get back in and hurt the hosta. They're just living in that hollow dead stalk, that dead flower stalk. So you're providing the home for the next generation of bees. Let's think about bumblebees. Here's a queen bumblebee that the queens come out late in the summer into early fall. They spend the winter as queens. You've probably seen some great big bumbles out this spring. Those have spent the winter underground, just tucked down 10 or 12 inches underground. Now they're looking for flowers. They're gathering pollen and nectar, and they're looking for a place to nest. So there was a 2-year study across the state of Ohio actually looking for the rusty patch bumblebee, and those researchers, including Karen Goodell and Randy Mitchell at University of Akron, every bumblebee that they saw on a flower, they took note not only of what species of bumble it was, but what flower was being visited. And so they came up with some top favorites of the bumblebees, and luckily bee balm, monardas were the top plant that bumbles really enjoyed, but also the clovers, red clover, white clover. I was surprised that crown vetch made the list at number 3. I didn't think that anything really visited crown vetch, but if you're a hungry bumblebee and there's not much else to feed on, I guess you're going to go to crown vetch. So I wouldn't suggest that you plant crown vetch, but if you have it anyway, at least it has a benefit to bumblebees. Goldenrod's really top pollinator plant there, and then bird's foot trefoil, which is that little yellow or early blooming plant in low plant in the pea family. So some of the top picks there for bumblebees. So a pollinator doesn't care whether you think a plant is a weed or not. I really love red clover. It's one of my favorite plants to allow a couple of them to kind of mix in with my perennials in the landscape. That big round flower head is so easy to observe bumblebees. They're just magnets for bumbles. It's really easy to take pictures of bumblebees when they land on your red clover. And red clover is fairly easy to manage. It doesn't seem to get out of control. It forms a clump. It will reseed, but a gardener can kind of keep up with that. So I encourage you to kind of rethink what's really weedy. Does it have some benefits for pollinators? Our fields up here in Stark County are rich with purple dead nettle right now. So the weed in the top left of the slide, that's the weed that forms that purple cast of the farm fields in spring. A member of the mint family, it's a winter annual, so likes those cool temperatures. And probably if you're in the bottom counties of the state, the southernmost counties, you're done with purple dead nettle. So a really early blooming weed, providing a nice nectar source for those early pollinators. Then we moved into dandelions. The dandelions and the mustards, really important for honeybees and other bees. Those spring yellows, beekeepers call them, because that's when the colonies are really growing. They're bringing lots of pollen and nectar back to the colony. So, have a little more tolerance for dandelions. They really have a good benefit to lots of kinds of bees. And then late in the season, some of our asters that we may think of as being a little weedy, but again, really important to get those bees well fed in the fall. For example, queen bumblebees, to help them survive the winter. And here's buckhorn. So this is that little tiny stalk that's in your grass, sometimes a grassy weed, right? You see those little spires come up. Well, it's blooming, and this is a tiny little bee, a tiny little sweat bee that's visiting that buckhorn. So sometimes it's allowing a little more lawn diversity, letting some of those weeds go to flower. We really will invite some bees as well. So here's a queen bumblebee. This is a brown belted bumblebee that you might see out there right now. Maybe your Virginia bluebells are in bloom, depending on where you are in the state. This is when I start to think about bumblebee queens being out looking for nests. So this bumble spent all winter tucked about 10 or 12 inches underground in just a little cavity, not in an old nest or not in her new nest, just kind of dug underground. So she comes up in the spring, she starts to gather pollen and nectar and needs a place to nest. So bees of all types are what we call central place foragers, and that means they nest in one central place. So that bumblebee nesting there in or on the ground, or maybe in a cavity in a rock wall, that's the central place. And then she forages out from there. Her workers then, once she rears daughters, will forage out from there, coming back to that central place. So this little tunnel nesting mason bee, the females will nest in those tunnels or tubes. Then they forage out from those tunnels, maybe only 800 feet or so, coming back to that central place. So this idea of central place foragers is really key for inviting bees into our gardens. You can have all the flowers that you want, but if you don't have places for bees to nest, especially the small bees, that tiny little sweat bee on that buckhorn, they're not going to be able to find your flowers because they have to live close by. So having some of those nesting elements are really important. That can be allowing a little more bare soil, especially if you know you have some of the solitary ground nesting bees. So these are little mining bees that could nest. You see those little volcanoes or places where tunnels are underground. Those are the entrance holes. And those bees are solitary ground nesting bees. So totally different than social ground nesting wasps like yellow jackets. These bees are very docile. Many of them can't even sting you if they tried. They don't swarm. They actually will hide down in that tunnel rather than come out to find you. So allowing some of that bare ground if you already have it, promoting some of that or conserving some of that space if you have solitary mining bees or polyester bees. And then allowing some of those other nesting or resting habitats. Maybe you have a couple tunnel nests or some places for bees to nest in twigs or stems. So on the left, I have some of my perennials that I've cut back. I finally did my fall cleanup. It's only April, right? But when I cut those stems back, those dead stalks from last year, I tend to cut them off at knee height, somewhere between knee height and hip height. And what those hollow stalks provide then is small little spaces for solitary bees to nest. These bees don't get back in, they don't hurt the plant, they just live in those dead stems. And pretty soon the leaves and the flowers from your perennials kind of fill out there. You don't even notice those stalks. On the right, you see this is a more pithy stem. This is from my, my fennel. And so I cut my fennel off, and then there's a tiny little bee that will carve out a little hole in the center of that stalk, and that's where she nests and rears her young. Again, doesn't hurt my fennel. It's hard to hurt fennel, right? But provides those bees a little place to nest. Similar to your raspberries, if you're cutting back your raspberry canes, those are hollow in the center, nice for those little solitary tunnel nesting bees. Doesn't hurt the raspberry. Raspberries actually, you know, the flowers aren't that attractive to us. We don't think that many bees would find them, but they love the raspberries. So you're going to see bumbles and honeybees and lots of other kinds of bees if you go out there and watch your raspberries in flower. So allowing some of those natural nesting habitat areas is really key to bringing a diversity of bees into your garden. Whether that's bare soil or those tunnel nesting. Here's our polyester bee who's coming out of that, that volcano of soil that she's dug out of last year's tunnel. Some other elements, so those bunch grasses we see here on the right, sometimes bumblebees will nest underneath your bunch grasses. They either nest on the ground or in the ground. Because bumblebees don't overwinter as a colony in the ground or in the nest, they don't need a nice insulated place to nest. So they can nest actually right on the ground, just a little protected from predators. And then think of our leaf cutting bees. They need some elements to create their little nesting cells in hollow twigs. So a leaf cutting bee will take 30 or 40 little different pieces of leaf disc and make a little nursery cell in a hollow cavity. Maybe it's the center of your bamboo wind chimes or the drain holes in your metal patio furniture. And one by one, she's cutting out these leaf discs and flying back to that little nursery cell, making a little nesting cell, putting pollen and nectar in the middle, laying an egg, and then covering up that little cavity with more leaf discs. So if we have some soft leaves around, these are some ash trees and some oak seedlings that come up in my berry patch. I just kind of let them go because the leaf cutting bees like to come and I share those leaf discs with them. You know, cosmetically, this is hardly an issue to me. I think it's cool to know that those bees are around. But if this bothers you, cosmetically, you just trim those leaves off. They like to go to those early soft leaves. Here's another a kind of nesting habitat that you maybe hadn't thought of. This is your lamb's ear leaf, and you can see my leaf there on the right. Do you see a little bald spot? It has some of the hairs removed. And so that's evidence that we have a wool carder bee who's come by. You can see this is the female. She was underneath that leaf on the leaf vein, gathering up a little ball of leaf hairs. So instead of building her little nesting cell with leaf discs, she uses those leaf hairs to make a nice little soft mattress, then gathers the pollen and nectar, lays her egg there, and then more of that fuzzy mass to finish off that nursery cell. So if you ever see a bald spot on your lamb's ear, you'll know that you have some of these wool carder bees there. But here's another option. I was at a friend's garden last year, and she had a lot of milkweed that had gone to seed. And here was a little wool carder bee that was gathering that nice fluff from the milkweed seeds, gathering them up into balls and then taking them back to some cavity where she was rearing, provisioning that cell to rear her offspring. Okay, so another element that we want to remember is that to promote pollinators, to promote insects in our gardens, we want to protect them from pesticides. So as master gardeners, we're always thinking about integrated pest management, different strategies that we can use to lessen the chemical use in the landscape. And this is really key for pollinators as well. We never want to apply a pesticide to a flower in bloom, and that's true whether it's a flower in the lawn. So think of some of your dandelions or your white clovers that are blooming in the lawn area. Those pesticides on the flowers, that's where bees are going to be visiting. So it depends on the pesticide, but often there are effects on the learning and behavior of bees. So we want to be really careful to only use pesticides that are labeled for plants, labeled for the problem. We always want to follow the label and think about bee safety. So reducing our use of pesticide whenever we can. A lot of gardeners are concerned about buying plants that have neonicotinoids or other chemicals already in them as they were growing in the nursery. So it's always a question that you can ask wherever you're buying plants. Are they using those soil drench products and those systemic pesticides that might have an effect on pollinators in the landscape? One option is that you could cut off the flowers, and it seems kind of counterintuitive, but let's say you bought a flat of plants that may have been treated with a neonicotinoid. You just pinch off the flowers. By the time new flowers are produced, most of that chemical should be out of the plant, and there wouldn't be concentrations of sizable amounts to affect bees, either in the pollen or in the nectar. Or you find a grower that promises they don't use those products or grow your own, and so then you know exactly what's being used to produce those. So by using all those different elements, what an amazing landscape we've created for wildlife, right? For butterflies, for birds, for bees. We've planted lots of different flowers of different shapes and sizes and colors. We have a succession of bloom through the season. We've massed flowers together as an invitation for pollinators to come and visit. And then we've taken care of some of those garden elements that help pollinators. We've created some nesting opportunities. Maybe we provide a water source for thirsty pollinators. We protected our pollinators from pesticides. And so we've created this really amazing landscape for ourselves and for all those creatures that come to visit. So do one thing for pollinators. We're close to Earth Day here, and we're thinking about some things that we can do to improve the ecosystem. It can be overwhelming, right? All the work that needs to be done, but think of just one thing that you can do. Maybe that's planting one mountain mint. This was our top plant in our phenology garden study, as well as other studies. Really a key pollinator plant, has several weeks worth of bloom, has a nice nectar source, has a beautiful smell and texture. It has a nice flat-topped structure in the landscape. And best of all, from a gardener's perspective, it doesn't go underground like peppermint and spearmint. Stays in a clump. Now that clump does get bigger, but it doesn't go underneath and come up through your bricks and through your pavers. So there are lots of different mountain mints on the market, but seek them out. Find a mountain mint or a friend who has one who can share. I just wanted to put a plug in for iNaturalist, which is a free app that you can put on your phone or your iPad or your computer. And you can take pictures of anything living or formerly living. So it can be a flower, a tree, a leaf, a bee, a butterfly, a spider, even fossils. So anything living or formerly living. That observation then goes up into the cloud, and experts weigh in to help you identify what you've seen. We have a project called the Ohio Bee Atlas. So any bee images that you take, any observations, automatically come to build our Ohio Bee Atlas. So we appreciate all of our observers who are out there taking pictures of bees on flowers. You don't have to know what the bee is, but once it's identified, you have kind of a life list then on your phone or on your computer, which is a great thing to have. I go back and kind of look at, which butterflies did I see last year? Which goldenrods? I'm always trying to learn my goldenrods, so I can go back in and see that kind of expertly curated list of goldenrods. A couple places to go for more information. So the Xerces Society and Pollinator Partnership, two of our main nonprofits that focus on pollinator issues, and lots of great resources on their websites, plant lists, recommendations, bee identification guides. And then I'm at beelab.osu.edu. So I also have a lot of resources, links to other organizations, plant lists, and free PDFs. And so remember to plant more flowers for pollinators, protect that habitat for nesting and resting, be careful about your pesticide use, and then help tell other people what you're doing and why they should get on the bandwagon.
All right,
and finally, my contact information. Great, thanks, Pam.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm just going to say, here's the Bee Lab again, beelab.osu.edu, and my email, ellsworth.2@osu.edu.